XX. June, 1864 to April, 1865. Petersburg. At no period during the Civil War was there such depression in all circles throughout the North as after Grant's bloody repulse at Cold Harbor. The expenses of the war were nearly $4,000,000 a day. Gold was at a high premium, and advancing rapidly. It went from 168 in May, 1864, to 285 in July. The terrible casualty lists of the Wilderness Campaign had brought mourning to every hamlet in the country. Although stimulated by enormous bounties, enlistment had almost ceased. It was under these circumstances that Grant, after a week of indecision, decided to transfer his army to the south of the James, and thence move directly upon Petersburg. It was the supreme crisis of the war. "Grant's movement," says General Alexander, "involved the performance of a feat in transportation which had never been equalled, and might well be considered impossible without days of delay." His object was to capture Petersburg, then to turn Beauregard's intrenchments in front of Butler at Bermuda Hundred, and move on Richmond. The capture of Petersburg would cut off Lee's lines of supply by the Weldon and the South Side Lynchburg railways, and would leave no unbroken line entering the capital except the Richmond and Danville. This road Grant purposed seizing later, thus compelling Lee to abandon Richmond, and retreat toward Danville or Lynchburg, to avoid investment. Grant's movement was accomplished without mishap, and in such incredibly short time, that Lee for 3 days refused to believe it. During this period, from the 15th to the 17th of June, Grant's whole army crossed the James and assaulted Petersburg, which at first was defended only by Beauregard with 2,500 men. In the meantime, Lee, with the corps of Longstreet and Hill, lay idle in the woods on the north side of the James. On Saturday, 11th of June, the Fifth Corps (Warren) was moved down the Chickahominy about 10 miles, to the vicinity of Bottom's Bridge. The next night it crossed on 2 pontoon bridges, and took position east of Riddle's Shop, where it entrenched to cover the passage of the other corps. The Second Corps (Hancock) crossed on the same bridge; the Sixth (Wright) and the Ninth (Burnside) at Jones Bridge; and all marched to Wilcox Landing, on the James. The 18th Corps (Smith) was sent back to White House, where it took transports for City Point, and was landed there the night of the 14th. Here it was joined by Cott's cavalry, 24,000 strong, and Hincks's colored division, 3,700, making in all about 16,000 men. This force was ordered to move at dawn on the 15th, and attack Petersburg, which was only 8 miles distant. Here we shall leave them for the moment. Hancock reached the James on the night of the 13th, and the 3 other corps during the course of the following day. Pending the construction of the bridge on the 14th, Hancock's corps was ferried across the river by the transports which had brought Smith to City Point. By the morning of the 15th the whole corps was across, and at 10:30 set out for Petersburg, to join Smith, who had marched at sunrise. Hancock had 20,000 men, and only 16 miles to go. All the complicated details of this movement had been thought out with remarkable care, and fully covered in the orders and instructions, with a single exception, and this oversight postponed the fall of Petersburg for over 9 months. The whole trouble came from the supposed political necessity of keeping Butler in command of the Army of the James. As Smith's corps was a part of that army, it was necessary to have his orders issued from headquarters, and on the 14th Grant visited Butler for that purpose. On his return Grant neglected to notify Meade of the details of the orders to Smith, and Meade, of course, could not inform Hancock. It thus resulted that Hancock did not march until 10:30, when he could just as well have started 5 hours earlier, and furthermore, he was not directed by the shortest route. He therefore arrived in front of Petersburg after dark, too late to assist in Smith's attack. Meanwhile the 3 other corps of the Army of the Potomac awaited on the north side of the James the construction of "the greatest bridge which the world has seen since the days of Xerxes," says General Alexander. At the point selected, the river was 700 yards wide, 90 feet deep, and had a rise and fall of 4 feet, causing very strong currents. The construction was begun simultaneously at both ends at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 14th of June, and finished at midnight. The artillery and trains immediately began to cross, and the Ninth, Fifth, and Sixth Corps followed in the order named. At midnight of the 16th, Grant's entire army was south of the James. Considering the size of the river, it was as great a feat as Napoleon's passage of the Danube in the face of the enemy with his army of 150,000 men, in July, 1809. To return now to Smith's column of 16,000 men, which began its march on Petersburg at sunrise on the 15th of June. Beauregard, who was in command there to gain time, sent forward a battery and a regiment of cavalry, which delayed the march of the Federals for about 3 hours. But about 9 o'clock the head of Smith's column came in sight of the Confederate works. The lines of Petersburg, then some 10 miles in length, encircled the city about 2 miles out, from the river above to the river below. The entrenchments consisted only of a small outside ditch and a parapet, with platforms and embrasures for guns at suitable intervals. There were no obstructions in front, but the forest had been felled within the zone of fire. Beauregard had a good supply of guns and ammunition, which he used freely, to delay the placing of the Federal batteries and the deployment of their troops. Smith took time for a long and careful reconnaissance of the Confederate position, which convinced him that the entrenchments were held only by a very thin line of infantry. He therefore decided to attack, not with a column, but with clouds of skirmishers. It was now 5 o'clock, and another hour was taken to form the troops. When all was ready, it was found that the artillery horses had been sent to water, and it took another hour to get them back. That hour saved Petersburg. By such small and accidental happenings does fate decide battles. At 7 o'clock the Union guns opened fire, and the cloud of skirmishers advanced to the attack. They carried about 1.5 miles of the entrenchments, capturing 20 guns and taking many prisoners. About 9 o'clock, Hancock came up with his corps and relieved Smith's troops. Smith had heard of the arrival of Confederate reinforcements, and he thought it wiser to hold what he had gained, rather than to venture more and risk disaster. During the night, Beauregard's engineer laid out, and began work on, a better located permanent line about 1/2 mile in the rear. At the same time, he was reinforced by the arrival of Hoke's division from Drury's Bluff, and by part of Johnson's division, which gave him in the morning about 14,000 infantry. Before the arrival of these troops, the whole force at Petersburg consisted of 1 brigade of infantry, not more than 1,200 strong; 2 small regiments of cavalry, and a few artillerymen. Note: a map of Petersburg can be found on page 407. On the 16th, the Ninth Corps arrived, and Hancock, who was now in command, had about 48,000 men. He attacked each flank of the broken Confederate line, and during the day succeeded in capturing 1 redan on the left and 3 on the right. On the 17th, the fighting began at 3 A.M., and was continued until 11 P.M. The first attack, made by Potter's division of the Ninth Corps, was a complete surprise to the exhausted Confederates. Another redan was captured with 4 guns and 600 prisoners; but no advantage was gained elsewhere. In a final assault, late in the afternoon, the Federals obtained temporary possession of 1 more redan, but were driven out, with the loss of over 1,000 prisoners. After the fighting ceased, the Confederate troops were withdrawn to the new line which had been prepared. At 4 A.M. on the 18th, a general assault was made by the Second, Fifth, and Ninth Corps, with the Sixth and 18th in reserve. Information had been obtained from the prisoners and a few deserters, that the Confederate lines were held by a very slim force, and the corps commanders were ordered to press the attack. The whole Union army was now at hand, and no further Confederate reinforcements had arrived, but practically nothing was accomplished during the whole day. This, as General Alexander remarks, is striking evidence of the condition to which the Federal army had now been reduced. General Lee did not discover until the morning of the 13th that the enemy was gone, and then for several days he was completely deceived regarding Grant's plans. Thinking that it was Grant's intention to advance on the north side of the James, so as to draw nearer to Butler, he moved his army across the Chickahominy and took position between White Oak Swamp and Malvern Hill. Hoke's division alone went on to Drury's Bluff, and later was sent to Petersburg, as we have seen. No other change was made in Lee's position until the morning of the 16th, when Pickett's and Field's divisions of Longstreet's corps were sent to the lines at Bermuda Hundred, to take the place of Johnson's division, withdrawn by Beauregard the night of the 15th for the defense of Petersburg. Kershaw's division followed only as far as Drury's Bluff, and was halted there. Meanwhile, Beauregard had repeatedly reported to Lee the arrival of Grant's army in front of Petersburg, and begged for reinforcements. Lee replied on the morning of the 16th that he did not know the position of Grant's army, and could not strip the north bank of troops. At noon on the 17th he again said, "Until I can get more definite information of Grant's movements, I do not think it prudent to draw more troops to this side of the river." At 6:40 P.M. on the 17th, Beauregard telegraphed Lee that unless reinforced he might be compelled to evacuate the city very shortly. Upon receipt of this dispatch, Kershaw's division was started for Petersburg. As soon as the fighting ceased, at about midnight, Beauregard took more radical measures to convince Lee of the situation. During the night, within 2 hours, he sent 3 members of his staff, one after another, to report to Lee. The first officer, who arrived about 2 A.M. on the 18th, could not convince Lee, and the second was not allowed to see him, as he was sleeping. The third, who came at 3 A.M., insisted on an interview, and succeeded in convincing Lee, from the statements of prisoners, that Grant's entire army had been across the James for over 48 hours. Lee immediately set his army in motion for Petersburg. As a part of his general plan of operations, on the 5th of June, Grant had started Sheridan westward with his cavalry to break up the Virginia Central and Fredericksburg railways. Sheridan also had orders to form a junction at Charlottesville with Hunter, who had succeeded Sigel in command in the Shenandoah Valley. Hunter had defeated the Confederates in that region, and was then moving toward Lynchburg. This part of his task Sheridan was unable to carry out, as he found the Confederate cavalry under Wade Hampton across his path, and could not shake them off. He therefore returned to White House on the 21st of June. This expedition, known as Sheridan's Trevilian Raid, thus ended in failure, like so many others. In the meantime, an even more famous raid was in progress. On account of ill health, Ewell had been succeeded in command of the Second Corps by Early, who was sent by Lee on the 13th of June to the Shenandoah. He drove Hunter over the mountains into West Virginia, then marched down the valley, crossed the Potomac, and on the 11th of July reached the outskirts of Washington. There was great alarm throughout the North, and Grant sent Wright from Virginia, with 2 divisions of the Sixth Corps. He arrived on the 12th, at the same time as General Emory, from New Orleans, with part of the 19th Corps. There were enough troops in Washington to defend the city, but these reinforcements made the situation doubly sure. Early, pursued by Wright, retreated to Virginia. As a result of this last Confederate invasion of the North, Grant sent Sheridan to command the Union forces in the Shenandoah. He expelled Early from the valley, and so thoroughly devastated that granary of the Confederacy that, to use his own words, "a crow would have had to carry its rations if it had flown across the valley." On the 7th of August, 1864, Sheridan assumed command of the forces for the protection of the valley, subsequently known as the Army of the Shenandoah. His appointment was opposed by Secretary Stanton, who thought that Sheridan was too young for such important responsibility. Grant had decided that the valley must be rendered useless to the Confederacy for future aggressive operations, and Sheridan was ordered to devastate it in a way as little injurious to the people as possible. On the morning of the 10th of August, Sheridan, who had massed his army at Halltown, in front of Harper's Ferry, moved against Early's line of communications. On the 12th, his cavalry came up with the enemy's rear guard at Cedar Creek. Here Early was reinforced, and Sheridan made preparations to retire to a position better suited for defense. After an engagement at Winchester, he fell back to Halltown. Then the pressure of Grant's army at Petersburg caused the recall of Early's reinforcements, and Sheridan moved forward once more. About this time Grant visited the Valley and found everything to his satisfaction. At 2 A.M. on the 19th of September, Sheridan's army advanced to attack Early in front of Winchester. After a hot engagement, which lasted all day, the enemy was driven in disorder from the field, and only darkness saved Early's army from capture. The Federals pursued the following day, and found the enemy in a strong position at Fisher's Hill. After a careful reconnaissance, Sheridan decided to turn the Confederate position. The movement was entirely successful, and the enemy was driven from the field in confusion. Early refused to fight again, and retired up the valley to Port Republic. Staunton was captured by the Union cavalry, and all the army stores destroyed. Kershaw, who was at Culpeper on his march to Lee, was ordered to rejoin Early. Sheridan was opposed to the government plan of operating against central Virginia from his base in the Valley, on account of the difficulty of protecting his long line of communications; and he was finally ordered to withdraw, destroying on his return march everything which could be of value to the enemy. It was a severe measure, but excused, like Sherman's burning of Atlanta, as the necessity of war. Sheridan placed his army on Cedar Creek, north of the Shenandoah. On the 15th October, he was called to Washington for a consultation with Secretary Stanton and General Halleck. During his absence, at early dawn on the 19th, Early surprised the Union troops in their beds, and the left and center under Crook and Emory were driven from their positions. Wright's men, who were in reserve, made only a short resistance. The whole army fled in disorder toward Winchester. Stopping overnight at Winchester on the 18th, on his return from Washington, Sheridan heard the noise of the battle the following morning, and hurried to the field. His coming restored confidence. He readjusted the lines, and then ordered an advance. It took less time to drive the enemy from the field than it had required for him to gain it. Night ended the pursuit at Fisher's Hill. Early lost 3 battle flags and almost all his artillery and trains. The battle of Cedar Creek has been immortalized in song and story. It was one of the most spectacular victories of the Civil War. This practically ended the operations in the Valley. Sheridan's command passed the winter at Kernstown. Toward spring, most of the infantry and all of the cavalry rejoined Grant's army in front of Petersburg. Sheridan had about 43,000 men in the Valley, and his total losses were 17,000. Early never had over 20,000. His losses are unknown. Grant did not renew his assaults on Petersburg on the 19th of June. Orders were given to entrench the positions gained by the several corps, and the 2 opposing lines in this part of the ground remained practically unchanged until the end of the siege. The Federal losses from the 13th to the 18th of June were over 10,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing. Since the opening of the campaign on the 5th of May, the casualties had been in excess of 62,000. No returns exist for Beauregard's losses at Petersburg, but they have been estimated at a total of 4,700. The losses of general officers on both sides were very severe. Federals, 6 killed, 8 wounded, 2 captured, total 16. Confederates, 8 killed, 15 wounded, 2 captured, total 25. The most interesting episode in the long and tedious siege of Petersburg was the affair of the mine. This promised to be a great success, but through the neglect and cowardice of some of the principal actors it turned out a dismal failure. Running approximately parallel to the general line of the Confederate works, was the deep valley of Poor Creek, the western edge of which was only 400 feet from a point in their front called Elliott's Salient. The salient was held by Pegram's battery, and Elliott's brigade occupied the adjacent lines. By the assaults of the 17th and 18th of June, the 9th Corps (Burnside) had gained an advanced position in front of the salient. Along the farther edge of the valley, the Union troops built strong rifle pits, with elaborate headlogs and loopholes, from which a constant fire was kept up on the enemy's works. In the valley behind there was ample room to collect and mass a large force, out of view of the Confederates. Lieutenant Colonel Pleasants, who had been a mining engineer and who belonged to the 48th Pennsylvania, composed for the most part of miners from the upper Schuylkill coal region, suggested to his division commander, General Robert Porter, the possibility of running a mine under the salient in front of this point. The plan was approved by General Burnside, and work was begun on the 25th of June. A gallery was successfully extended over 500 feet, with two branches at the end, to the right and left, each 37 feet long. These branch galleries were charged with gunpowder in 8 parcels of 1,000 pounds each, connected by open troughs of powder to be fired by safety fuses coming through the tamping and along the gallery. All the preparations were finished on the 28th of July. The last of June, General Alexander became convinced that the enemy was preparing to mine the position at the salient, and warned General Lee, who ordered his engineers to start countermines. The shafts, however, were located on the right and left flanks of the battery, and the countermines did not meet the Federal gallery, which was so silently built that the Confederates did not know of its proximity. The morning of the 30th July was chosen for the explosion of the mine, and all preliminary arrangements were made, such as massing the troops, removing parapets and abatis to make passage for the assaulting columns, and so on. No possible precaution was overlooked by General Meade, and very explicit orders were issued. On the morning of the 30th, Lee had in the lines about Petersburg only the 3 divisions of Hoke, Johnson, and Mahone, about 18,000 men, most of the balance of his army being 20 miles away. 3 of the Union Corps and parts of 2 others, with 2 divisions of Sheridan's cavalry, 16 divisions in all, some 60,000 men, were concentrated to follow up the surprise to be given by the explosion. Everything had been so carefully prepared that it is difficult to explain how the attack failed so completely. One cause was the same which on the 12th of May nullified the Federal surprise at the Bloody Angle at Spotsylvania. Too many troops had been concentrated, and they were in each other's way. The main reasons, however, were the cowardice of 2 of the Union division commanders, Ledlie and Ferrero, and the negligence of one of the corps commanders, Burnside. These 3 officers, with 2 others, Wilcox and Bliss, were subsequently censured by a military court, and Burnside resigned from the service. The assault was to be led by Ledlie's division of the 9th Corps, followed by the colored division under Ferrero, but both these commanders took shelter in a bomb proof, where they remained during the entire action. The mine was fired at 4:40, 10 minutes before sunrise, and the explosion made a crater 150 feet long, 97 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. The parapets were partially destroyed and largely buried by the falling earth. 2 guns, 22 cannoneers, and perhaps 250 infantry were carried up in the air. The assaulting columns literally swarmed into this crater, until it was packed so full the men could hardly move. Considering the surprise and the novelty of the occasion, the Confederates rallied very quickly. The decided lack of energy on the part of the assailants permitted the defenders to form barricades, which were successfully held to the last. The attacking column, instead of spreading out, remained massed in the crater, and made no further advance. The reinforcements in the rear were prevented from coming up. Finally, Meade ordered all offensive operations to cease, and the men were withdrawn. The Federal casualties for the day were in excess of 4,000, while the Confederates lost less than 1,500 men. Between this period and the month of March, 1865, several movements of the Union armies were made to the left and the right, which resulted in the extension of the intrenchments in both directions, and a corresponding prolongation of the Confederate lines. As these operations possess but little interest, no attempt will be made to narrate them in detail. Each of Grant's movements at the time had some special object beyond extending his lines. Toward the end of July, for example, Hancock was sent to the north bank of the James with his own corps, the Second, and the 10th Birney. Grant's thought was to prevent Lee from sending more reinforcements to Early in the Valley. Hancock remained there until the 20th of August, when he was recalled. On the 18th of August, Warren was sent on an expedition against the Weldon Railway with the same object in view to force Lee to withdraw some of his troops from the Shenandoah. While he was tearing up the track, Warren was attacked by Hill and lost nearly 3,000 men. He then withdrew to open ground about a mile back and entrenched. No further attacks were made, and the Union lines were then extended by the Ninth Corps from the Jerusalem Plank Road to connect with Warren's lines on the Weldon Railway. CHAPTER XX. Petersburg, Part II. The last week in October, Grant made another movement to the left with the view of turning Lee's right, and seizing the South Side Railway. The operation was not a success, and the Union troops were withdrawn to their former positions. In December, Warren was again sent on an expedition against the Weldon Railway, and destroyed some 20 miles of track. This increased the difficulty of supplying the Confederate army. At the beginning of February, another ineffectual attempt was made to turn the Confederate right and seize the South Side Railway. Note: the Siege of Petersburg map can be found on page 414. This movement made by the Second and Fifth Corps was met by Lee's right, and checkmated. The Union line had now been extended to Hatcher's Run near the crossing of the Vaughan Road, and the Confederate entrenchments reached across the run at the Crow Farm, and from Burgess's Mill along the White Oak Road, and west of the Claiborne Road. The winter was unusually severe, and the Confederate troops, with their insufficient clothing and meager food, suffered terribly. They had no coffee or tea or sugar, except in the hospitals, and only a little meat, mostly imported from abroad. The condition of affairs throughout the South was truly deplorable. The loss to the army by desertion averaged 100 men a day, the soldiers leaving in response to frantic appeals from their families at home. In March, 1865, the Confederate lines were so extended that it was 37 miles by the shortest route from the extreme left on White Oak Swamp, below Richmond, to the extreme right beyond Petersburg. At this time Lee's army was reduced to about 50,000 men, and Grant had 124,000. Early in March, Sherman had advanced into North Carolina, where he was confronted by General Joseph E. Johnston, who had been placed in command of a small Confederate force composed of the garrisons of Savannah and Charleston, and the remnants of Hood's army which had been brought over from Tupelo, Mississippi. It was evident that Lee would soon be forced to abandon Richmond and Petersburg, and endeavor to join Johnston, to crush Sherman before he could unite with Grant. But prior to undertaking this almost impossible task, General Lee determined upon one last effort to break up Grant in his immediate front. On the 25th of March, he gave orders to Gordon, now in command of Early's corps, which had rejoined, to assault Fort Stedman, which was only 200 yards in front of his line. The Union troops were taken by surprise, and the fort captured, but the assailants were soon driven out with very heavy losses. Fearing that the object of Lee's assault was to induce him to transfer troops from his left to his right, which would make it easier for Lee to withdraw his army and begin his retreat, Grant decided to take the initiative at once, and move around Lee's right flank. Leaving only one division, Devens, north of the James, and 2 divisions under Weitzel in the Bermuda Hundred lines, Grant began to transfer all the rest of his infantry, about 90,000 men, and all of his cavalry, to his extreme left. On this occasion, Grant narrowly avoided the mistake made by Hooker in May, 1863, by Lee in June, 1863, and by himself in May, 1864, of sending his cavalry off on a raid against the railways. He countermanded such an order issued on the 28th, and kept his cavalry with the infantry. On the 31st of March, Lee sent the 2 divisions of Pickett and Johnson, about 6,600 strong, and 2 of Fitz Lee's divisions of cavalry, 5,800 men, on an expedition against Sheridan, who was driven back in much confusion nearly to Dinwiddie Court House. During the night, Pickett, who was far in advance, was nearly cut off by Warren's corps; but he succeeded in withdrawing to Five Forks, 4 miles from Lee's right flank. Here he made the mistake of halting and entrenching, assuming that he would be reinforced. The following morning he was attacked by Sheridan's cavalry and Warren's corps, and routed. 3,244 of his men were captured, with 11 colors and 4 guns, while the Federals lost only 634 men. The whole action was fought in the absence of Pickett and Fitz Lee, who were only a mile away, but heard no sound of the battle, owing to the same peculiar conditions of the atmosphere noted at Perrysville and Chancellorsville. After the action was over, Sheridan removed Warren from the command of the Fifth Corps, under charges of which he was afterwards fully acquitted by a court of inquiry. On the 2nd of April, Grant renewed his attacks on the Confederate right, breaking their line and forcing it back. The Federals then gained possession of the South Side Railroad, and pursued the enemy toward Petersburg, until stopped by the fire of Fort Gregg. In this last day's battle General A. P. Hill was killed. He had borne a conspicuous part in every action fought by the Army of Northern Virginia, except Spotsylvania, where he was ill. That night Lee abandoned Richmond and Petersburg, and started his army westward, in the hope of reaching either Danville or Lynchburg ahead of Grant. He had expected to find rations at Amelia Court House, but by some blunder the supplies had gone on to Richmond. This caused a delay of 24 hours to collect supplies from the country. In the last phase of the campaign, Grant for the first time used his cavalry to the best possible advantage. Instead of sending Sheridan off on some useless raid, he kept the cavalry with the main army, and did most effective work. But for the Union horsemen, Lee might have reached the mountains of Virginia, and prolonged the struggle for several months. After the evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond, Grant followed Lee on the south side of the Appomattox River. Weitzel was sent to take possession of Richmond, which surrendered at 8:15 the following morning. Sheridan's cavalry and the Second and Sixth Corps led in the pursuit. Both armies were trying to reach the junction at Burke's Station, and the Federals won in the race. At Sailor's Creek on the 6th of April, Ewell's corps, which formed the rear guard, was cut off, surrounded, and captured, some 8,000 men, with 6 general officers, including Ewell himself and Kershaw. After sundown on the 7th, Lee received the first letter from Grant proposing a surrender. April 7, 1865. General: The result of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood, by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. U. S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Within an hour General Lee sent back the following reply: April 7, 1865. General: I have received your note of this date. Though not entertaining the opinion you express on the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia, I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood; and therefore, before considering your proposition, ask the terms you will offer on condition of its surrender. R. E. Lee, General. During the afternoon of the 8th, Lee received Grant's reply to his inquiry as to the terms proposed. Grant said that, peace being his great desire, there was but one condition upon which he should insist, namely: that the officers and men surrendered shall be disqualified from taking up arms again against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. He concluded by saying that he was ready to meet Lee for the purpose of arranging the terms. Lee immediately prepared his answer, and sent it to Grant the same evening. He said that he did not intend, in his previous note, to propose the surrender of his army, but to ask Grant's terms. He added: I cannot therefore meet you with a view to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia, but as far as your proposal may affect the Confederate States forces under my command, and tend to the restoration of peace, I should be pleased to meet you at 10 A.M. to morrow, on the stage road to Richmond, between the picket lines of the two armies. Some time before the fall of Richmond, Grant had received a letter from Mr. Lincoln, prohibiting him from embracing anything of a political nature in any negotiations that he might have with General Lee. As Lee's letter seemed to imply such a discussion, Grant decided to avoid the proposed meeting. He accordingly replied on the morning of the 9th, that he had no authority to treat on the subject, and that the proposed meeting could do no good. Meanwhile, the Confederate army had arrived within 2 miles of Appomattox Court House, only to find the road barred by Sheridan and Ord. Lee sent orders to Gordon and Fitz Lee to clear the way, but they could make no progress against the large forces already in their front. On receiving Gordon's report, General Lee exclaimed: "Then there is nothing left to me but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Lee accordingly wrote Grant, asking an interview in accordance with the offer contained in his letter of the 8th, and rode to the rear, hoping soon to meet Grant and be able to make the surrender. That morning, Meade had taken the responsibility of granting a truce, pending the negotiations for a surrender. When this was arranged, Lee returned to his front, and stopped in an apple orchard, 100 yards or so in advance of the line, where General Alexander had some fence rails piled under a tree to make him a seat. Within 2 days, this tree was cut down for souvenirs by the Confederate and Federal soldiers. Here, while talking with General Longstreet, Lee received Grant's final letter, sent by Colonel Babcock of his staff. It read: April 9, 1865. General R. E. Lee, commanding C. S. A. Your note of this date is but this moment, 11:50 A.M., received. I am at this writing 4 miles west of Walker's Church, and will push forward for the purpose of meeting you. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, U. S. Grant, Lieutenant General. This meeting, by a strange coincidence, took place in the house of Major Wilmer McLean, who had owned the farm on Bull Run, on which had occurred the first collision between the two armies at Blackburn's Ford on the 18th of July, 1861. His house there was used for a time as the headquarters of General Beauregard. To avoid the active theater of the war, he moved to the quiet village of Appomattox. Thus the first and the last scenes of the war in Virginia took place upon his property. The house was a plain 2-story wooden structure, standing a little distance back from the street, with a yard in front. A wooden porch, reached by 7 steps, ran the length of the house. On each side of the hall, there was a single square room, entered by 2 doors, and having 2 windows, one in front and one in rear. General Lee was accompanied only by his military secretary, Colonel Marshall, and a single courier, who held the horses during the meeting. Lee reached the house first, and entered the room on the left to await the arrival of General Grant, who came about 1:30. It was Sunday, the 9th of April, 1865. General Grant had in his party Generals Sheridan, Ord, and Ingalls, and 9 members of his staff, including General (then Colonel) Horace Porter, who has given us a very interesting account of the interview. General Grant sat at a marble topped table in the center of the room; Lee at a small oval table near the front window, and facing Grant. Some of the party found seats on the sofa and the few chairs in the room, but most of them stood. "The contrast between the 2 commanders," says General Porter, "was striking, and could not fail to attract marked attention." Grant, then nearly 43 years of age, was 5 feet 8 inches in height, with shoulders slightly stooped. His hair and full beard were a nut brown, without a trace of gray in them. He wore a plain blouse of dark blue flannel, an ordinary pair of top boots, with his trousers inside, and was without spurs. His boots and uniform were spattered with mud. He had no sword; and apart from the shoulder straps which designated his rank, his uniform was that of a private soldier. Lee, on the other hand, was fully 6 feet in height, and erect for one of his age, for he was Grant's senior by 16 years. His thick hair and full beard were a silver gray. He wore a new uniform of Confederate gray, and carried at his side a long sword of very fine workmanship, the hilt studded with jewels. He wore top boots with handsome spurs. Like his uniform, his boots were remarkably clean. A felt hat, the color of his uniform, and a pair of long buckskin gauntlets, lay beside him on the table. After a few words of general conversation, General Lee suggested that Grant should put his terms in writing. Whereupon Grant called for his manifold order book and wrote his well known letter, which he handed to General Lee to read. Lee laid it on the table beside him, while he drew from his pocket a pair of steel rimmed spectacles, and wiped the glasses carefully with his handkerchief. Then he adjusted the spectacles very deliberately, and read the letter carefully, When he came to the sentence about the officers being allowed to retain their side arms, horses, and baggage, he said with considerable warmth of manner, "This will have a very happy effect upon my army." In answer to a question from Grant as to whether he had any suggestions to make regarding the terms, Lee said, after a little hesitation, that the men in his cavalry and artillery owned their own horses. Grant replied that the subject was new to him. Then he added that, without altering the draft as written, he would instruct the officers appointed to receive the paroles "to let all the men who claim to own a horse or mule take the animals home with them to work their little farms." Lee showed a very lively appreciation of this concession, which, he said, would have the best possible effect upon the men, and would do much toward conciliating his people. Grant then ordered one of his staff to copy his letter in ink, and while this was being done, Lee had Colonel Marshall draw up for his signature a letter of acceptance of the terms of surrender. After the letters had been copied and signed, Lee spoke of his lack of provisions for his men, and Grant offered to send him at once 25,000 rations. At a little before 4 o'clock, General Lee shook hands with General Grant, bowed to the other officers, and with Colonel Marshall left the room. As soon as the horses were saddled, he mounted, saluted the Union officers by raising his hat, and rode slowly away. General Grant and his staff then mounted and started for the headquarters camp, which was now pitched near by. Firing of salutes had already begun, but Grant ordered these stopped at once, saying that the war was over, and the rebels fellow countrymen once more. On his way to headquarters, Grant was reminded that he had not yet announced the important event to the government. He dismounted, sat down on a large stone by the roadside, and wrote the following dispatch to Secretary Stanton, dated 4:30 P.M. General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia this afternoon on terms proposed by myself. The accompanying additional correspondence will show the conditions fully. U. S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Lee was appointed to the command of the Army of Northern Virginia on the first day of June, 1862. In the brief period of 2 years, 10 months, and 9 days, with an army always inferior in numbers, poorly equipped, and badly supplied with food and clothing, he had fought 7 great campaigns against 6 picked generals of the Union. With a force which never exceeded 80,000 men, he had put hors de combat 262,000 Federals. There is no parallel in history to this record, except Napoleon's 12 major campaigns, covering a period of 19 years. The effective strength of the Union army at the beginning of the final operations was 120,000, and the losses up to the day of the surrender were 10,515. Grant's entire losses since crossing the Rapidan were 124,000, a number about double the maximum strength of Lee's army. At the time Lee evacuated Richmond he had about 50,000 men. His losses during the retreat are unknown. There were 28,231 men paroled at Appomattox. But Lee had lost large numbers by capture or desertion since leaving Petersburg. Grant did not enter the Confederate lines after the surrender. He designated General Joshua Chamberlain to command the parade on the day that the Confederate soldiers marched out to lay down their arms and colors. On the morning of the surrender, the 10th of April, General Grant rode out about 9 o'clock, and had a final interview with General Lee, between the lines of the two armies. Their conversation was entirely private, but as afterwards reported by Grant, it was mainly on the subject of peace and reconciliation between the two sections. Grant urged Lee to use his great influence to bring about this happy result. Lee, however, was averse to stepping beyond his duties as a soldier, and said the authorities would doubtless soon arrive at the same conclusion without his interference. There is no foundation for the statement that Grant asked Lee to see President Lincoln regarding the terms of reconstruction. After this interview, which lasted about half an hour, Lee rode back to his camp to take a final farewell of his men, and Grant returned to the McLean house to await the hour of his departure. Some of his officers who had been visiting the enemy's camp now returned, with Wilcox, who had been groomsman when he was married; Longstreet, who had also been at his wedding; Heth, who had been with him in Mexico; Gordon, Pickett, and several others. At noon, Grant mounted his horse, and with his staff started for the station to take the train for Washington. Lee set out for Richmond the same day. For the first time in 4 long, bloody years, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia turned their backs upon each other. Grant's movement from Cold Harbor to the south bank of the James, says Major Steele, belongs to a class of strategical operations which are considered among the most hazardous and difficult in warfare. It was a flank movement involving the crossing of close and wooded country by narrow roads, and the passage of 2 difficult streams, the Chickahominy and the James, over which pontoon bridges had to be laid. Grant and his efficient staff are entitled to great credit for the skill with which the operation was carried out. The Union army had over 50 miles to march. Lee held nearly all the bridges across the Chickahominy, and had better roads, as well as fuller knowledge of the country, to aid him in attacking the right flank of Grant's columns. The Union army was withdrawn from a position only a few hundred yards from the enemy in the widest place; and the movement was so effectively screened that Lee was kept in ignorance of Grant's plans from the time he started, the night of the 12th of June, until the morning of the 18th, when Grant had his army concentrated in front of Petersburg. Taken as a whole, the operation must be considered one of the finest achievements of strategy in military history. Then came the fatal mistake of the campaign: Hancock's waiting for his rations on the morning of the 15th of June. This delay of 6 hours probably prolonged the life of the Confederacy 9 months. Yet no blame attaches to Hancock's fine record. The fault was entirely General Grant's, and the explanation of it is very plainly intimated by General Alexander, although he attributes the neglect to give Hancock proper orders mainly to the political necessity of placing Butler in command of the Army of the James, which was really only a secondary cause. As the primary object of Grant's campaign in front of Petersburg was to get possession of the 2 railways leading into Richmond from the south and southwest, it is not easy to understand why he could not succeed in less than 9 months. Major Steele's explanation is, that Lee's army was never really invested; that he was so favored by the relative positions of Richmond and Petersburg, and the conformation of the 2 rivers, that Grant could not leave a small force in front of Petersburg, to detain Lee, while he moved with his main army against the railways, without thereby giving Lee an opportunity to seize the Union base on the James. "Knowing as much as we do now about trench warfare," writes General Maurice, "it is easy to see that, without a far greater preponderance of artillery than he possessed, Grant had at no time much chance of carrying the Confederate lines. The rifles of 1864 were precise enough, and could be fired sufficiently rapidly to make assault a dangerous expedient unless the defenses had been flattened out, and the defenders driven from them by accurate bombardment, or unless the attack could be made in overwhelming numbers and regardless of loss. Throughout the siege, Grant's superiority in numbers was rarely more and often less than 2 to 1, while Lee's watchfulness was such, and his handling of his reserves so masterly that, though Grant was always free to choose his point of attack on a very lengthy front of defense, he was never able to accumulate sufficient strength to crash through the defenses. The battle of the Crater ended in a similar failure to that of the Bloody Angle of Spotsylvania, and for much the same reasons. Grant would have, indeed, been much better advised to have avoided a direct attack, and relied earlier upon the policy into which he was forced by events, of continually extending his left and so gradually cutting off Lee's lines of supply. But his plan of keeping Lee tied to the defenses of Richmond and Petersburg, while elsewhere the Federal forces steadily reduced the area from which the troops in those defenses could draw men, food, and munitions, was the best possible. Lee's great weapon was maneuver, and Grant had taken it from him. Events proved that no plan was better calculated to undermine the morale of the people of the South. In further explanation of Grant's inability to accomplish his object, we give below the official returns of the 2 armies for the 7 months from June to December, 1864. Federals in June, 107,000; Confederates, 55,000. Federals July, 77,000; Confederates, 57,000. Returns for the Federals in August, 59,000; Confederates, 35,000. In September the Federals 77,000, and the Confederates 35,000. In October, Federals 85,000, Confederates 47,000. In November, 87,000 Federals, and Confederates 56,000. And finally in December the Federals 110,000, and the Confederates 67,000. In the 5 months June to October inclusive, Grant's casualties were over 47,000, and his forces were further reduced by detachments sent to Washington and the Shenandoah, so that he was not strong enough compared to Lee to assume a more aggressive policy. End of chapter 20. Conclusion. The story that John B. Floyd, while Secretary of War in the cabinet of Mr. Buchanan, transferred guns from Northern to Southern arsenals in order to arm the South for the Civil War, has been told and retold so often that it is still believed by many Northerners. It is not so generally known that this charge was investigated by a committee of Congress, which, in February, 1861, made a report showing it to be groundless. The chairman of that committee was Mr. Stanton, afterwards Secretary of War, who was one of the most prominent Republicans in the House. The facts are that in 1859, the armory at Springfield, Massachusetts, had become so crowded that it was necessary to remove some of the arms stored there. Accordingly, in December, 1859, nearly a year before the election of Mr. Lincoln, the War Department ordered about 1/5 of the guns at Springfield distributed among 5 Southern arsenals. The total number of arms thus transferred was 125,000, of which all were obsolete patterns, except 10,000 rifled muskets. About 400,000 of the old guns, and all of the new and improved ones, were kept in the North. In reality, the South, at the outbreak of the Civil War, was poorly supplied with arms and ammunition. According to Mr. Davis, in the Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, the 6 arsenals in the South, which were only storehouses, contained just 15,000 rifles, and 120,000 muskets, the latter mostly of antiquated patterns. Another authority states that the South had about 150,000 small arms, of which only about 20,000 were modern rifles. In a memorandum to Mr. Davis, General Gorgas, Chief of Ordnance of the Confederate Army, writes: "We began in April, 1861, without arsenal, or laboratory, or powder mill of any capacity, and with no foundry or rolling mill except in Richmond; and before the close of 1863, we supplied them." With no stock on hand even of such necessary articles as copper, leather, and iron, in that short period the South created, almost literally out of the ground, foundries and rolling mills at Richmond, Selma, Atlanta, and Macon; smelting works at Petersburg; chemical works at Charlotte; a powder mill at Augusta equal to any in the United States; and a chain of arsenals, armories, and laboratories stretching from Virginia to Alabama. Without any previous industrial organization; shut off by the blockade from the commerce of the world; crippled by a depreciated currency; obliged to send nearly every able bodied man to the field; unable to use slave labor except in the most unskilled departments of production, such an achievement of industrial organization has never been surpassed in the history of the world. At the outbreak of the war, General Rains, of North Carolina, who had been professor of chemistry at West Point, left a prosperous engineering business at New York, to enter the service of the Confederacy. He was almost at once put in charge of the proposed powder mill at Augusta. He immediately set parties at work to explore the caves of the mountains of Virginia and Tennessee for saltpetre. Cellars and old tobacco works were searched for nitre, and immense beds were developed at Columbia, Charleston, Savannah, Augusta, and Mobile. All the material obtained in this way was sent to Augusta, where, under the direction of General Rains, the powder mill became the most famous example of Southern industrial efficiency. When the Union troops evacuated Harper's Ferry after setting fire to the arsenal, civilians rushed in, and saved a large part of the machinery. By the end of 1861, this machinery, set up at Richmond and Fayetteville, was turning out thousands of muskets and firearms of every description. Prior to that time, the Southern arsenals had hardly a machine above the complexity of a foot lathe. The South had no skilled laborers to speak of; but a few men like Ball, who literally died of overwork, trained the hundreds who were willing. Lead, at the rate of nearly 80,000 pounds a month, came in from the mines near Wytheville, Virginia, to be smelted in the new plant at Petersburg. Every Confederate victory brought large supplies of arms and ammunition. The battlefields were literally combed for guns and bullets, with excellent results. Within the Southern Confederacy, at the outbreak of the war, there were no arsenals at which guns were manufactured, except a small plant at Fayetteville, and the United States Arsenal at Harper's Ferry. The story of how the South armed its soldiers is an interesting one; and the way in which the emergency was met is a matter of which all Americans today may be proud. There were but 6 sources of supply. 1. The weapons already on hand. 2. Conversion of old sporting arms to military use. 3. Manufacture of new arms. 4. Purchase in the North. 5. Purchase in Europe. And 6. Capture from the enemy. The first has already been mentioned; and the supplies obtained from the next 3 sources were so small as almost to be negligible. At first every gunsmith in the South was kept busy altering and repairing private arms, but the results were not satisfactory. There was not much more success with the manufacture of new arms. The machinery for making the long rifled musket, saved at Harper's Ferry, was set up at Richmond, but the output never exceeded 1,000 guns a month. The machinery for making the short Harper's Ferry rifles was sent to Fayetteville, where, in April, 1862, it began to turn out about 400 rifles a month. There were also a number of private gun factories in the Confederacy, but it is difficult to obtain definite data about them, and their output seems to have been small. At the beginning of the war the South found little difficulty in making contracts with a number of Northern manufacturers to supply arms; but this matter became such a scandal that the government put a stop to it by a strict embargo on all shipments to the South. When the Confederacy found the factories of the North closed to it, the authorities turned to Europe. In May, 1861, Major Hughes was sent to England, where he succeeded in buying 12,000 Enfield rifles. He also contracted for a lot of 100,000 Austrian rifles from the Imperial Arsenal at Vienna. There was little trouble in running these guns through the blockade. In February, 1863, General Gorgas reported that Major Hughes had shipped over 131,000 guns, of which 81,000 were long and short Enfield rifles and carbines. At the same date 23,000 rifles at London and 30,000 at Vienna were awaiting shipment. The long Enfield rifle, a splendidly made weapon, was the official arm of the British infantry, and proved the most popular gun with the Confederate army. It was about the same size and weight as the Springfield rifle, used by the Union troops, and would take the same cartridge. It has already been stated that the South armed and equipped itself at the expense of the enemy, and it is certain that a large proportion of the arms used by the Confederates were captured from the Federals. General Gorgas reports that during the 4 years of the war 320,000 small arms were issued from the main arsenal at Richmond. Probably one half of these were captured guns. Richmond was the great arms clearing house for the East, and guns gathered on the Virginia battlefields were sent there to be put in order and reissued. Many of the finest patterns, however, like the Spencer carbines, were useless, because the Confederates could not get the cartridges. During the last months of the war, a machine was devised for turning out the cartridges, but it was too late to be of service. The beginning of the Civil War found the North almost as unprepared as the South. Of the 198 companies in the regular army, 183 were guarding 79 posts on the western frontier, while the remaining 15 garrisoned the Canadian border, the Atlantic coast, and 23 arsenals. Few posts had even so much as a battalion, and in many cases a small company was split up into detachments. To hold in security 3,000,000 square miles of territory, the United States had less than 13,000 men. When South Carolina seceded, there were few regular officers who had commanded as much as an assembled battalion. Their military life had been passed in the scattered forts along the Indian frontier, where, as expressed by General Ewell, a veteran of nearly 20 years' service, they had learned all about commanding 50 United States dragoons and had forgotten everything else. The militia of the several states had had no training in field service, and were of little value for national defense. A breech loading rifle, the first of the successful repeaters, was invented this year, 1860, by Christopher Spencer, and was destined to have considerable influence on some of the latter battlefields of the war. Only a few of them, however, could be manufactured in time to be of service, and nearly all the troops were armed with old fashioned muzzle loading muskets. The Springfield arsenal was the only service manufactory of small arms in the United States, and its output did not exceed 2,500 a month. As above stated, the Secretary of War, Mr. Floyd, had sent a part of the supply of small arms to the Southern arsenals, which immediately fell into the hands of the seceding states. At first the Federal troops were so ill provided that even flint locks were issued. The markets of Europe were scoured by Federal agents, and every kind of weapon available was purchased at a high price. The calibers were as varied as during the Revolution, and few soldiers could use the ammunition of their comrades, even in the same company. Although Parrott and Rodman had produced the best types of rifled cannon, none had been adopted by the government; but there was an abundant supply on hand of smooth bore guns of iron and brass of all calibers. Since the government had no foundries of its own, the new cannon was hurriedly manufactured and poorly tested. The consequence was that many burst when they were first fired. The guns used were of many sizes and patterns, and on one battlefield of the war 36 different kinds of balls were picked up from the ground. Immediately after the secession of the Southern States, nearly 1/3 of the 900 officers in the old army resigned their commissions, and 65 of the cadets at West Point resigned or were discharged. With the exception of 26 men, however, the rank and file remained in the service of the North. No effort was made by the Union to utilize the experience of regular officers with the volunteers. The men of the local regiments were allowed to elect their officers. Many of the former officers who offered their services were ignored. Grant, who was in business, wrote the War Department, but was not even honored with a reply. Many graduates of West Point served throughout the war in minor capacities, while regiments were commanded by men with no military training or experience. The records show what the North lost by this remarkable procedure. 51 major generals, 91 brigadiers, and 106 colonels came from the officers of the old army; but as against these 248, there were 308 former officers who were kept in subordinate positions. The South, on the other hand, made early provision to accept the services of officers of the United States Army, and to give them their original relative rank. Of the 250 who went with the South, 182 rose to the rank of general officer, including such men as Lee, Jackson, Longstreet, and the 2 Johnstons. In addition, as already stated, the Confederacy created ranks suitable to the units commanded; whereas on the Union side, armies, corps, and divisions were commanded indifferently by major generals. The South organized early. It took the utmost advantage of every trained soldier among its adherents. It quickly concentrated in main armies. It gave confidence and stability to the troops by placing recruits beside old soldiers in the ranks. It clung to its leaders in the face of defeat, and did not harass them. It built up morale in every possible way. The primary organization of the North, on the other hand, was chaos. It did not seem to know how to make use of the few trained soldiers it had. It put excellent leaders in untenable positions, failed to support them properly, and promptly relieved them when they failed. By its ignorance of military affairs, it destroyed the morale of as brave troops as ever marched. The result was that the war dragged out for 4 long years, with an inordinate loss of life and public treasure. "I am of the opinion," writes Colonel Henderson, "that in order to discover the secret of the Confederate successes, there is no need either to search for nice distinctions in races closely akin, or to appeal to the fact that Lee and his great Lieutenant Jackson were a head and shoulders above any Union leaders who had as yet appeared. It was not only the genius of its commanders that won the laurels of the Virginia army. Many of its victories were achieved by sheer hard fighting; they were the work of the soldiers themselves; and that the Confederates were able to wrest success from opponents of equal vigor was due to their superior organization, more accurate shooting, and, above all, to their stronger discipline. As to the first, the Federal Government allowed the pernicious principle of the election of the officers by the rank and file to flourish without restraint; and secondly, the strength of the army was kept up, not by a constant stream of recruits to the seasoned battalions, but by the formation of new regiments. The Southerners, on the other hand, early adopted the conscription; the superior officers were appointed by the Government, and the recruits sent to fill the vacancies in the ranks. Few "political regiments" existed in the South. Men commanded because they were competent to command, and not because they could influence votes. Secondly, a great advantage in favor of the Confederate troops was their skill as marksmen. Lastly, as to discipline, the rich planter, possessing many slaves dependent on him, acquired habits of command and organization highly useful to the officers of an army. President Davis was a graduate of West Point. He had served with distinction in Mexico, and afterwards as Secretary of War. He had thus had many opportunities of learning the capabilities of the officers of the old army, and this knowledge he turned to good account. His selections for command were very judicious. All the regular officers who joined the Confederacy were given high commands, and no civilians were placed in positions of responsibility until they had demonstrated their fitness by handling troops in the field. Taught by military experience, Mr. Davis did not remove a commander because he had been unfortunate. Both his greatest generals, Lee and Jackson, met with reverses, but retained his confidence. He refused to accept the resignation which Lee tendered after Gettysburg. The only great mistake he made was in relieving Johnston in 1864. In the North, on the other hand, the military policy was very different. Commander succeeded commander with startling rapidity. The Army of the Potomac was commanded by no less than 6 different officers; each one of whom, except the last, Grant, was degraded for ill success. Neither President Lincoln nor his Secretary of War, Mr. Stanton, had had any previous knowledge of military affairs; but notwithstanding, they attempted to dictate to their generals in the field. Many of their selections for high command were unfortunate, and in too many cases were dictated by political rather than military considerations. The appointment and the retention in positions of responsibility, of such men as Butler, Banks, Fremont, and Sigel, is hard to excuse. It was not until the last year of the war that the President and his advisers learned wisdom, and forbore to interfere with Grant and Sherman. "It is a significant fact," says Colonel Henderson, "that during the War of Secession, for the 3 years the control of the armies of the North remained in the hands of the Cabinet, the balance of success lay with the Confederates. But in March, 1864, Grant was appointed Commander in Chief. Lincoln abdicated his military functions in his favor, and the Secretary of War had nothing more to do than to comply with his requisitions. Then, for the first time, the enormous armies of the Union were manoeuvred in harmonious combination, and the superior force was exerted to its full effect. Lincoln, when the army he had so zealously toiled to organize, reeled back in confusion from Virginia, set himself to learn the art of war. He collected, says his biographer, a great library of military books; and if it were not pathetic, it would be almost ludicrous, to read of the great President poring night after night, while his capital was asleep, over the pages of Jomini and Clausewitz. And what was the result? In 1864, when Grant was appointed to the command of the Union armies, he said: "I neither ask nor desire to know anything of your plans. Take the responsibility, and act, and call on me for assistance." He had learned at last that no man is a born strategist. The first year of the war was one of unpreparedness; the second, of mismanagement; the third, of alternate success and failure. The fourth year marked the end of the political mismanagement of the forces. A trained soldier for the first time took full control of military operations. It had required 3 years of war to teach the Union authorities that trained professional soldiers should run armies, just as much as educated surgeons should manage hospitals. "In war," said Napoleon, "men are nothing. It is the man who is everything. The general is the head, the whole of an army. It was not the Roman army that conquered Gaul, but Caesar. It was not the Carthaginian army that made Rome tremble in her gates, but Hannibal. It was not the Macedonian army that reached the Indus, but Alexander. It was not the French army that carried the war to Wasser and the Inn, but Turenne. It was not the Prussian army which, for 7 years, defended Prussia against the greatest powers of Europe, but Frederick the Great." "The history of famous armies," writes Henderson, "is the history of great generals; for no army has ever achieved great things, unless it has been well commanded." The history of the Army of the Potomac well illustrates this point. Between the soldiers of the North and the South there was little difference in martial qualities. Both were equally strong in defense, and displayed that stubborn resolve to maintain their ground which is characteristic of the Anglo Saxon race. "My men," said Stonewall Jackson, "sometimes failed to drive the enemy from his position, but to hold one, never." The Federal generals might have made the same assertion with equal truth. But if the armies were well matched in defense, it must be conceded that the Confederates were more vigorous in the attack. At Antietam, McClellan had twice as many men as Lee. At the second Manassas, on the first day, Pope outnumbered Jackson 2-1; yet on both occasions the smaller force was victorious. Except at Borodino, where he held his old guard in reserve, and probably wisely, Napoleon never hesitated to put in his last man. Just before the battle of Chancellorsville, Lincoln warned Hooker to put in all his men; and the final defeat of the Union army was due mainly to the commander's failure to follow this advice. The Federal generals invariably kept large masses in reserve, and these masses were never used. Again, the Federal soldiers in the East fought under the terrible disadvantage of having no confidence in their leaders. McClellan won the affection of his men, but it is doubtful whether they ever gave him credit for dash or resolution. The other commanders of the Army of the Potomac did not succeed in inspiring either love or confidence. In the West, the Union armies were more successful because they were better commanded, while the Confederates were led by men of inferior ability as compared with Lee, Jackson, and Longstreet. Yet the Western armies of the Confederacy were fully as brave and as well disciplined as those of Virginia. Without in any degree disparaging the high reputation of the Confederate soldiers, we may say, then, that it was not the Army of Northern Virginia which for 3 years kept the Federals at bay in front of Richmond, but Lee; not the Army of the Valley which paralyzed the Washington government in 1862, but Jackson. Strategy is defined as the art of bringing the enemy to battle, while tactics are the method by which a commander seeks to overwhelm him when battle is joined. Grand tactics, the art of generalship, include those stratagems, manoeuvres, and devices, by which victories are won, and concern only those officers who may find themselves in independent command. Minor tactics include the formation and disposition of the three arms for attack and defense, and concern officers of every rank. Defeat is far more often due to bad strategy than to bad tactics. So the Confederates, despite their numerous successes, were beaten in the end through strategical faults: the failure to concentrate in sufficient numbers to reap the fruits of victory; the unnecessary dispersion of the troops; the deliberate disregard of the great end of strategy, namely, the annihilation of the enemy's fighting men, and the destruction of his material resources. To bring a stubborn enemy to his knees, the war, like that of Rome against Carthage, must be carried into Africa. Stonewall Jackson constantly advocated the invasion of the North, but in the councils of the South political expediency overrode military considerations. Mr. Davis, always trusting that sooner or later the European powers would intervene, chose defense, not defiance, as his motto. Whenever he could seize the initiative, Napoleon never hesitated to invade the enemy's territory, even when he was inferior in strength to the mass of the opposing forces. The wisdom of an offensive policy is shown by the campaign of Gettysburg, where the Confederacy was within a stone's throw of independence. But the South, having deliberately chosen a defensive policy, made good use of its opportunities. Strategical points which lay at a distance from the main field of operations were garrisoned with the very smallest force compatible with security, while the two main armies, in Virginia and in the West, were always maintained at the greatest possible strength. There was one notable and fatal exception to this rule. After the loss of the Mississippi, by the fall of Vicksburg and Port Hudson, no less than 55,000 men were retained west of the river, where they were absolutely useless to the Confederacy. These troops, transferred either to Virginia or to Tennessee, might have turned the almost evenly balanced scale. The explanation probably is that many of the Southern soldiers objected to serving outside their own States. The strong feelings of States' rights is shown by the fact that Lee always preferred Virginians, both officers and men, for his own army. Throughout the war the Confederates possessed the great advantage of interior lines, of which they availed themselves on many occasions. Thus, in 1863, after Gettysburg, Longstreet was sent west with 16,000 men from Lee's army, and enabled Bragg to gain the important victory of Chickamauga, which prolonged the life of the Confederacy for many months. It must be said, however, that this shifting of strength from one wing to the other was made feasible by the errors of the Federals. It was not until Grant took command in 1864 that the Union forces operated in combination. Grant seems to have been the first to recognize the fact that the true objective of a campaign is the defeat of the enemy's main army. Before he took command, as Sherman well expressed it, "The trouble was that the commanders never went out to lick anybody, but always thought first of keeping from getting licked." Grant was always ready to force the fight, and his policy of constant hammering, although terribly and unnecessarily expensive, was in the end successful. Some of the most remarkable victories in the war, such as the first and second Manassas and Chancellorsville, were won by two distinct forces, approaching the field of battle from different directions, and crushing the enemy between them. Moltke has laid it down that the junction of two previously separated forces on the field of battle is the highest triumph of generalship. But Napoleon, although on more than one occasion he availed himself of the expedient, was never weary of pointing out the risk. In all ages the power of intellect has asserted itself in war. It was not courage and experience only that made Hannibal, Alexander, and Caesar the greatest names of antiquity. Napoleon, Wellington, and Archduke Charles were certainly the best educated soldiers of their time; while Lee, Jackson, and Sherman probably knew more of war before they waged it than any one else in the United States. Surprise has been the foundation of almost all the grand strategical combinations of the past, as it will be of those to come. To what Federal soldier did it occur, on the morning of Chancellorsville, that Lee, confronted by 90,000 Federals, would detach the half of his own small force of 50,000 to attack the enemy in flank and rear? The heaven born strategist takes no counsel of his fears. Knowing that success is seldom to be won without incurring risks, he is always greatly daring; and by the skill with which he overcomes all obstacles, he shows his superiority to the common herd. The enlistments in the Union army during the Civil War aggregated 2,562,611. This does not include 105,000 seamen and marines, or some 230,000 militia and "emergency men," who served for short terms. Many of the enlistments, however, were for terms of only 3 to 9 months, and the number, reduced to a term of 3 years, was 1,556,678. It is not so easy to give exact figures for the Confederate army. Colonel Livermore says: "It is most disappointing that the mass of records published by the War Department contains no summary of the numbers who were under arms on the Confederate side. General Cooper, the Adjutant General of the Confederate Army, stated soon after the war that no such summary existed." On the contrary, General Cooper stated: The files of this office, which could best afford this information as to numbers, were carefully boxed up and taken on our retreat from Richmond to Charlotte, North Carolina, where they were unfortunately captured, and, as I learn, are now in Washington. There is no doubt as to the fact that the files referred to by General Cooper were in the archives of the War Department as late as 1867, and why they have never been published officially is a mystery. The New York Tribune of the 26th of June, 1867, printed from "Our Special Correspondent" an article on this subject which for a long time was supposed to have been the work of Swinton, but later was attributed to Whitelaw Reid. It read: "Amongst the documents which fell into our hands at the downfall of the Confederacy are the returns, very nearly complete, of the Confederate armies from their organization in the summer of 1861 down to the spring of 1865. These returns have been carefully analyzed, and I am enabled to furnish the returns in every department and for almost every month, from these official sources. We judge in all 600,000 different men were in the Confederate ranks during the war." In the absence of official records, this is certainly good secondary evidence; and further confirmation is to be found in the fact that the American Cyclopedia (1875), edited by Charles A. Dana, late Assistant Secretary of War, quotes General Cooper's statement as to numbers without comment. Vice President Stevens, Generals Cooper, Early, Wright, and Preston, Dr. Jones, and Dr. Bledsoe, in fact all of the Confederate authorities who were familiar with the facts, agree that the total number of men in the army was about 600,000. Their estimates are based on the following figures: killed or died of wounds, 74,508; deaths from all other causes, 125,836, for a total of 200,344; discharged, 57,411; deserted, 83,372; prisoners, 1865, 90,000; surrendered, 1865, 174,223; totaling 405,006. The two combined give us a total of 605,350. A very instructive report to the Confederate Secretary of War in January, 1864, covering only 6 states east of the Mississippi, gives the following statistics regarding those not in the service: deducted for disloyalty, 44,000; unaccounted for, skulkers, 70,000; exempt for all causes, 96,000; liable but not enrolled, 126,000, for a total of 336,000. Adding this total to the number of men actually enrolled, 605,000, we have an aggregate of 941,000, which accounts for all but 5% of the men of military age in the Southern States as shown by the census of 1860. During the first year of the war the Confederate ranks were filled entirely by volunteers. Then the act of the Confederate Congress of the 16th of April, 1862, authorized the President to call out for 3 years all white men resident in the Confederacy between the ages of 18 and 35. An act, approved the 27th of September, the same year, enlarged the conscription to include all white males, not exempt, between 18 and 45; and the act of the 17th of February, 1864, made all white males between 17 and 50 liable for service. The only reliable basis, therefore, for estimating the potential military strength of the Confederacy is the United States census of 1860. This gives in the 11 Confederate States a total of 984,475 white males between the ages of 18 and 45. It is thus demonstrated that the maximum possible strength of the Southern forces was less than 1,000,000 men. In the issue of Current History for August, 1923, there is a labored article by A. B. Castleman, in which he endeavors to prove that there were 1,650,000 men in the Confederate army. This, by the way, is an increase of 10%, or 150,000 men, from his previous estimate of 1,500,000 in the Century for March, 1892. Based upon the census, Livermore estimates the number at 1,239,000, and based upon the average strength of regiments at 1,228,000 to 1,406,000. On the usual assumption that 1 in 5 of a total population is of age for military service, the census of 1860, which showed in the Southern States a white population of about 5,500,000, would give an aggregate of 1,100,000 men of military age, but the actual figures were 984,000. Deducting the disloyal, the skulkers, the sick and unfit, and those legally exempt, we find that the actual military strength of the Confederacy could not have much exceeded 600,000 men. The "estimates" of Colonel Livermore, and other Northern authorities, that there were from 1,200,000 to 1,650,000 men in the Confederate service are therefore manifestly absurd. The maximum man power was less than 1,000,000, and no nation can possibly mobilize more than 60% of its entire male population. Granted that there were 3.5 millions of slaves to do the domestic work and furnish the manual labor, for raising the crops and working on roads and fortifications, there must have been a large proportion of the adult white male population engaged in non-combatant work, such as making arms, ammunition, and supplies of every kind for the army, as well as employed in clerical and other positions. In arriving at his figure of 1,239,000 for the number of men who came within the conscription acts, Colonel Livermore takes the census figures of 1860, then adds about 25% for the boys who reached the age of military service during the war, and assumes that they were all in the ranks. But this increase was fully counterbalanced by the number of men who passed the age of service; by deaths from natural causes, and by losses in battle. Moreover, fully 40% of the 1,000,000 adult white population of the Confederacy was in the 4 States of Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, from which comparatively few recruits were obtained during the last 2 years of the war. In the letters of General Lee to his government, we find constant complaints of the unsatisfactory results from the conscription. For example, on the 11th of February, 1863, he writes the Secretary of War that only 421 new men have joined, and 287 deserters returned, an aggregate of 708; while his losses by deaths, discharges, and desertions amount to 1,878. He begs the Secretary to use every means in his power to fill up the ranks. Colonel Livermore, in another place, estimates the total Confederate levies, reduced to a 3 years' term of service, at 1,082,119, as compared with a similar figure of 1,556,678 for the Union army. This would give the Confederates about 70% of the Union strength; but a comparison of the Confederate and Union rolls on the first days of January, 1863, 1864, and '65, gives them only 50%, approximately, of the Union totals. No adequate explanation of this discrepancy is offered. The total number of men in the 5 main armies of the Union and the Confederacy, in service at any one period during the last year of the war, was approximately as follows: Federals in Arkansas, 30,000, Confederates 20,000. In Tennessee the Federals 70,000, Confederates 40,000. Shenandoah 40,000 Federals, and 20,000 Confederates. In the Carolinas, 60,000 Federals and 30,000 Confederates. In Virginia, 100,000 Federals, 60,000 Confederates, for a total of 300,000 Federals to 170,000 Confederates. The same authority estimates the largest number of men in the Confederate army at any one time, the beginning of 1864, as 472,000. And assuming that the deaths prior to that date were 250,000, arrives at an aggregate of over 700,000. As the Confederate deaths during the entire war were about 200,000, these figures practically confirm the Confederate estimates. The total deaths in the Union army during the Civil War, as shown by the official records, and in the Confederate army as estimated by General Cooper, were: Federals killed or died of wounds, 110,000; Confederates, 75,000; Federals' deaths from other causes, 250,000; Confederates, 125,000. Total losses for the Federals, 360,000, and for the Confederates, 200,000. These statistics show that in the Union Army, 25 men died from disease to 11 who were killed or died from their wounds, while in the Confederate Army the ratio was 25 to 15, the average accepted ratio being 25 to 10. Taking into consideration the meager hospital equipment of the South, the comparatively small proportion of deaths from disease is difficult to explain; but there is no doubt of the fact that the Southerners proved themselves able to withstand the strain of war better than their Northern opponents. A whole volume might be written on the subject of numbers and losses, but we think that enough has been said to show that the Southern figures are substantially correct, and the Northern estimates grossly exaggerated. The history of the Civil War conclusively proves the truth of Napoleon's adage, that fortune always favors the heaviest battalions. There was but little difference in the fighting qualities of the two opposing armies. The South on the whole had abler commanders, a superior staff, and a more efficient intelligence department. The Confederate soldiers were better disciplined, more expert marksmen, finer horsemen, and more enduring marchers. Finally, the South had the enormous advantage of interior lines, and of acting generally on the defensive. The North finally won when it brought all its strength to bear, because it had far greater numbers, and enormous superiority in physical resources, such as arms, munitions of war, transportation, food, clothing, and hospital supplies. These advantages were to a certain extent counterbalanced by the fact that the Union armies were generally acting on the offensive, in the enemy's country far from their base, thus making necessary large detachments to guard their lines of communication. Many Federal troops also were employed in non-combatant work, such as was done by negroes for the Southern army. Moreover, during the first 3 years of the war, the Union generals were constantly hampered by interference from their government, and by lack of confidence on the part of their troops. "The success of our army," writes General Palfrey, "was undoubtedly greatly lessened by jealousy, distrust, and general want of entente cordiale." It is not necessary, therefore, to imagine that the South had twice as many soldiers as it really had, in order to explain why it took the North 4 long years to subdue a nation of a quarter its size. Opinions have always differed, and probably always will, as to the reasons for the failure of the Southern States to achieve their independence. Northern writers generally assume that it was due to the larger population and greater resources of the Union. Southern authorities ascribe it to a want of perseverance, unanimity, and even of loyalty on the part of the South. The main cause, however, seems to have been the bad financial policy adopted by the Confederate government. Mr. Davis and his cabinet must have realized that a full treasury was necessary to defray the expenses of a great war. But they deliberately rejected the best means of raising money, the sale of the large and valuable cotton crop. Statistics show that the cotton crop of 1860 amounted to nearly 4,000,000 bales, and it is estimated that the South had on hand at the outbreak of the war about 5,000,000 bales. During the war, the price of cotton reached almost fabulous figures in England. The mill owners were finally forced to shut down entirely, and 2,000,000 people were reduced to great distress. This cotton, if stored abroad at that time, could have been sold for at least $500,000,000, and probably for much more. The blockade of the Southern ports was proclaimed in May, 1861, but it was not at all effective until the following spring. There was thus a period of nearly 12 months during which shipments could easily have been made. "The sum raised in that way," writes General Johnston, "would have enabled the War Department to procure at once arms enough for 500,000 men, and after that expenditure the Confederate treasury would have been much richer than that of the United States." Not only could the forces of the Confederacy have been completely armed and equipped, but the men could have been well fed, well paid, and the sick and wounded properly cared for. The government, however, rejected this means of filling the treasury, and limited its financial efforts to printing bank notes, which soon became practically worthless. During the last year of the war the monthly pay of a soldier would scarcely buy one meal for his family. Many men thus compelled to choose between their loyalty to the State and their duties to their wives and children, left the army, or took every means to avoid military service, in order to support their families. The proposition that the Confederate Government should acquire all the cotton in the South, and ship it to Europe to be sold, was made when the problem of financing the war was seriously discussed, at the outbreak of hostilities. The owners were ready to accept any fair terms that might be offered; and at that time, as above stated, there would have been no difficulty in putting the plan into operation. But this wise policy was rejected by Mr. Davis and his advisers, in the expectation that the distress caused by the lack of cotton in England and France would lead these two powers to intervene, and force the United States to raise the blockade. Instead of relying on their own ample resources to win their independence, the Confederate States thus threw away their only means of financing the war. It was one of the worst political blunders in history, and it resulted in the loss of the struggle. With a full treasury, the success of the Confederacy would probably have been assured. The End of Campaigns of the Civil War, by Walter Geer. Recorded by Celine Major.